The moment Vernon Barnett rode into Dusty Creek, Texas, on a scorching Tuesday in June of 1882, Maggie Wilcox decided she did not like him one bit. It was not the horse, though the animal was undeniably magnificent, a broad-chested Appaloosa with a coat like splattered ink on snow, the kind of horse that belonged to a man who wanted to be noticed. It was not even the dust he kicked up as he came down the main road at a pace that suggested he owned every inch of ground his animal touched. It was the way he looked at the town, slowly, deliberately, like a man taking inventory of something he intended to purchase. Maggie was standing outside her father's general store, sweeping the planked walkway with a broom that had seen better days, and she watched him from beneath the brim of her wide straw hat. He was broad in the shoulders and narrow in the hip, with a sun-darkened jaw and dark brown eyes that swept the length of the street with cool, unhurried confidence. He had a rifle in the scabbard on his saddle, and a silver badge on his chest that caught the afternoon light like a mirror. A sheriff's badge. Or rather, as Maggie would learn approximately 4 minutes later when the man dismounted in front of the post office and announced himself to anyone within earshot, the badge of a United States Deputy Marshal out of Austin, come to Dusty Creek on official government business. Her neighbor, old Hector Crane, practically tripped over his own boots getting to the man to shake his hand. Maggie swept a little more firmly. "That's Vernon Barnett," said a voice beside her. She turned to find her friend Clara Mills leaning against the post, arms folded, watching the new arrival with the same careful study she gave everything that came through Dusty Creek. Clara was 23, same as Maggie, and she had eyes like a hawk and a tongue like a whip. "I heard Deputy Baxter talking about him last week, said they were bringing someone in from Austin to deal with the Sutter brothers." Maggie's broom slowed. The Sutter brothers, that was not a comfortable topic. Jeb and Dale Sutter had been terrorizing the ranches south of Dusty Creek for the better part of 2 years, running off cattle, burning fences. And last month there had been a confrontation at the McGrath farm that left old Emmett McGrath with a broken arm and his wife in tears on her front porch. The local sheriff, a decent but aging man named Delbert Poole, had done what he could. It had not been enough. "Apparently," Clara continued, lowering her voice, "they called in Barnett specifically. He's got a reputation." "For what?" Maggie asked. Clara looked at her with a small, knowing smile. "Getting things done." Maggie looked back at Vernon Barnett, who had now been surrounded by a small cluster of townsmen including Hector Crane, the barber, and 2 of the cattlemen who ran operations east of town. He was speaking to them calmly, one hand resting easy on his belt, answering questions with the kind of unhurried patience that in another man might have read as thoughtfulness but in him read, to Maggie at least, like the performance of a man who knew how impressive he was and had simply grown accustomed to it. She clicked her tongue softly. "He certainly seems to think highly of himself." Clara laughed and pushed off the post. "Give him a chance before you hang him, Maggie." But Maggie had already made up her mind. Arrogant, that was the word for it. A man who rode into a suffering town on a magnificent horse with a federal badge catching the sun, looking at everything like it was his to sort out. Arrogant. The word would come back to her in ways she had not anticipated. Dusty Creek was not a large town. It sat in a valley carved by a creek that ran strong in spring and thin in summer, surrounded by open range on 3 sides and a low ridge of cedar-covered hills to the west. The population was perhaps 400 souls if you counted the ranches in the surrounding territory, and it had the usual complement of a general store, a livery, a post office, a barber, a church, a schoolhouse, 2 saloons, a hotel, and a doctor's office above the apothecary. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew it themselves, which meant that by suppertime on Tuesday evening, every person in Dusty Creek knew that Deputy Marshal Vernon Barnett was staying at the Tanner Hotel, that he had already met with Sheriff Poole for 2 hours, and that he had asked pointed questions about the layout of the land south of town. Maggie knew all of this because her father, Roy Wilcox, was one of the men Vernon Barnett had spoken to that afternoon. Roy Wilcox was a wide, ruddy man of 52 who had built his general store from nothing 20 years prior and had watched Dusty Creek grow up around it. He was respected, practical, and largely unimpressed by strangers, which made it somewhat notable when he came into the kitchen that evening while Maggie was setting out supper and said, without preamble, "That Marshal seems sharp." "Sharp," Maggie repeated, laying out 2 plates. "Asked the right questions. Wanted to know about water sources, property lines, who the Sutters have dealing with in town." "He's not just blundering in." Maggie sat down. "That's his job, isn't it, to not blunder in?" Roy looked at her over the bread basket. "I'm just saying he seems competent." "Competent doesn't mean I have to like him." Roy raised an eyebrow but said nothing, which was the particular brand of wisdom that had kept him married to Maggie's mother, God rest her soul, for 23 years. Maggie thought about the word competent as she cleared supper. It was not the same as arrogant, but in her experience the 2 qualities had a habit of traveling together. The next morning, Wednesday, was when things became complicated. Maggie opened the general store at 7 in the morning as she did every day, unlocking the heavy door, turning the sign, and stepping behind the counter to begin tallying the morning receipts. Her father had a meeting with the Cattlemen's Association at 9, so she would be managing alone for the first few hours. That was fine. Maggie had been helping run the store since she was 14, and she was thoroughly capable. At 7:45, the door opened and Vernon Barnett walked in. He was in the same clothing as the day before, dark trousers, worn leather vest over a linen shirt, the badge catching the light, and he moved through the store with the same quality of attention he had given the street, scanning the shelves with those dark eyes in a way that was probably just habit but looked, to Maggie, like assessment. She watched him from behind the counter and said nothing. He picked up a tin of coffee, turned it over, set it down, picked up a different brand. He examined a box of ammunition, read the label with apparent interest, and then set it aside. He picked up a coil of rope, tested it between his hands, and draped it back over the hook. Maggie cleared her throat. He looked at her. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. Her voice came out pleasantly neutral, which she was proud of. "Possibly," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, not deliberately low, just naturally deep, the kind of voice that carried easily without being raised. "I'm looking for something specific. Cartographer's map if you carry one. Local territory, South Quadrant." "We have survey maps," she said. "From the land office. They came in last spring." She moved to the shelf on the east wall and retrieved the rolled tube she was thinking of. "This covers about 40 miles south and 20 east. Goes as far as the Sutter Plateau." She said it without thinking and then wished, very slightly, that she had not, because something shifted in his expression, not alarm, just awareness, like a man filing a piece of information. "That'll do," he said. She set it on the counter and named the price. He paid without complaint, which she had half expected him to argue about, and then, instead of leaving, he stood there looking at the counter for a moment. "You're Roy Wilcox's daughter," he said. Not a question. "I am," she said. "He mentioned you run the store most mornings." She was not sure why that felt like anything, but it did, very faintly, like the first note of a tune she did not yet recognize. "He mentioned you to me as well," she said. "Good things, I hope." "He said you were competent." Something moved in the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "High praise." "In this town it is," she said. He looked at her directly then, and it was the first time she felt the full weight of those dark eyes on her without them moving on somewhere else. It lasted only a moment. "Thank you for the map," he said, and picked it up and left. Maggie stood at the counter and breathed out very slowly. Stubborn, she thought. That was the second word. Not yet in reference to Vernon Barnett specifically, but it was the word that was going to matter, because of what happened at 4 o'clock that afternoon. It started with the water. There was a well at the center of Dusty Creek's main road, a community well that had been dug 15 years ago and maintained jointly by the town. In the last week, someone had been putting something in it. Not enough to make people gravely ill, just enough to make the water taste wrong, to turn it a faint yellow, to make the horses at the trough skittish. Maggie had noticed it 2 days prior and mentioned it to Sheriff Poole, who had looked into it and declared he was not sure what was causing it. At 4 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, Maggie walked to the well to collect the afternoon water bucket. The store kept a rain barrel in the back, but it had run low in the dry spell and found Vernon Barnett already there. He had his sleeves rolled up and was collecting a sample of the water in a small glass vial, which he stoppered and held up to the light with a focused expression. "You're testing the water," she said. "Someone's been adding iron sulfate," he said, still looking at the vial. "Probably been going in at night. It's not lethal in these concentrations, but it'll make animals sick enough to be unpredictable, and people uncomfortable enough to want to leave town for a while." Maggie stared at him. "Why would someone do that?" "Because the Sutter brothers want this town as a waypoint," he said, lowering the vial and looking at her. "If the townspeople are distracted by illness and bad water, they don't pay attention to what's moving through on the South Road at night." She thought about that. It was a disturbing piece of logic, the kind that made a familiar place feel suddenly different. "How do you know about the iron sulfate?" "Smelled it yesterday when I rode in," he said. "And I've seen it used before." She looked at him, then at the vial, then back at him. "What do we do about it?" "Seal the well temporarily. Use the creek water from upstream for now." "I'll set a watch tonight." He said it simply, as if it were already decided. And that was where the stubbornness came in, not in Vernon Barnett, or not yet, but in Maggie. "You're going to set a watch," she said, "by yourself. Sheriff Poole's going to help. That's 2 men. The Sutters travel in groups." "I'll manage." "You'll manage," she repeated. She could hear the edge in her own voice. "You've been in this town for 24 hours and you've already decided you know everything that needs to be done and exactly how to do it." He looked at her with that steady, unhurried look that she was already, against her will, beginning to catalog. "I didn't say that. You don't need to say it. It's implied by the way you stand there holding that vial like you're the only person who can see what's in it." She picked up her bucket. "I've lived here my whole life. My father has lived here longer. There are people in this town who have been watching the Sutters' movements for 2 years while you were somewhere else getting a reputation." A beat of silence. The late afternoon light was golden and long, and somewhere a horse shifted at the livery and a child called something across the road. "I hear you," he said. She had not expected that. "What?" "I said I hear you," he repeated, with no particular defensiveness. "You're right that I'm new here and you know this town better than I do. If there are things I should know, I'd like you to tell me." It was the most disarming possible response to what she had said, and she recognized with some irritation that he had delivered it with complete sincerity. She stood there with her bucket for a moment, recalibrating. "Talk to Mrs. Harlan," she said finally. "She's at the Blue House on 2nd Street. Her property borders the South Road and she's got a memory like a ledger. She'll tell you every time she's heard horses after midnight for the last 1.5 years. He nodded very slightly. "Thank you." She walked back toward the store and told herself that the small warmth that had settled somewhere behind her sternum was simply the heat of the afternoon. Behind her, she did not know that Vernon Barnett watched her go. He stood there for a long moment with the vial in his hand, and a look on his face that his fellow marshals in Austin would have found entirely unfamiliar, because it was soft, and he was not a man who wore soft expressions easily. Then he put the vial in his pocket and went to find Mrs. Harlan. That night, Maggie sat on the back step of the store and wrote in the small journal she kept, a habit her mother had started and she had continued. She wrote about the iron sulfate, about the Sutters, about the town she loved and the quiet fear that had been building in it for 2 years. She wrote, almost in spite of herself, about the man with the Appaloosa and the federal badge. She wrote, "He is stubborn in the way of a man who is entirely confident in his own competence, which would be easier to resent if the competence were not apparently genuine. Also, he heard me when I criticized him, which was unexpected. I am not entirely sure what to do with that." She thought about crossing it out. She did not. Thursday morning broke clear and hot, which was normal for Dusty Creek in late June. Maggie was behind the counter at 7, same as always, when Clara came in at 8 looking like she'd swallowed a story whole and was about to let it out. "What happened?" Maggie asked before Clara could speak. "They caught one of the Sutter men at the well last night," Clara said, breathless. 2 in the morning, apparently. Marshal Barnett and Sheriff Poole were waiting and they took him without a shot being fired. Maggie's hands went still on the counter. "Is everyone all right?" "Everyone's fine." The man, one of the Sutter's hired hands, not one of the brothers themselves, is locked up at the jail. Apparently Marshal Barnett got him talking by 6 this morning. Clara dropped her voice to something approaching reverence. "He knows where the brothers are camped." The morning went like that, people coming in and out of the store with news and speculation, the way they always did when something significant broke the surface of the day. By 9 o'clock the whole town was buzzing, and Maggie found herself fielding questions she did not have answers to while her father was at the cattlemen's meeting. At 10, Vernon Barnett came into the store. He looked the same as he always did, which was to say put together in the unconcerned way of a man who did not think much about his appearance, but happened to wear it well. There were shadows under his eyes that told her he had not slept, but his expression was settled. "I heard about the arrest," she said when he reached the counter. "It went smoothly," he said. "I wanted to thank you," she frowned. "Thank me." "For telling me about Mrs. Harlan," he said. "She had notes, actual written notes about what she'd observed, dates, times, numbers of horses. It helped me place where they've been staging." He paused. "I wouldn't have thought to ask her if you hadn't told me." Maggie was quiet for a moment. Behind her, a row of canned goods sat in perfect order because she had organized them that way, and outside the window the town went about its morning, and a man she had called arrogant 2 days ago was standing at her counter thanking her for being right. "You're welcome," she said, and then because she was honest when it mattered, "I may have been somewhat sharp with you yesterday." "You were direct," he said. "There's a difference. Some people don't see one." "I do," he said. It was a simple statement, but it landed with weight, because in Maggie's experience, very few people did. She was 23, and she had been running her father's store with competence and intelligence for years, and she had learned that directness in a woman was frequently read as something else, as sharpness, as difficulty, as something requiring apology. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light came through the front window and fell on the counter between them, and outside, someone drove a wagon past and called a greeting to someone on the other side of the road. "Are you going after the Sutter brothers today?" she asked. "Tomorrow," he said. "I need one more day to coordinate with the deputy out of Laredo who's been tracking them from the south." She nodded. And then, before she could think better of it, "Be careful." He looked at her. That same quality of stillness he had, the way he listened with his whole attention when he chose to. "I will," he said, and it did not sound like the automatic reassurance people gave when they were not really listening. It sounded like a promise. He bought a second tin of coffee before he left. She noticed he chose the same brand he had set down the first day, and as he went out the door into the morning heat, Maggie stood at her counter and thought about the word she had written in her journal the night before. Stubborn. She thought about revising it, but then she thought, no, stubborn was not wrong. He was stubborn. He was also competent and direct and honest, and he heard things when she said them. A person could be more than one thing at once. She knew that. She was stubborn herself, after all. She began to feel, very quietly, like she might be in some trouble. That afternoon brought another visitor to the store, one who was considerably less welcome than the deputy marshal, which was saying something given that Maggie had not entirely made up her mind about her feelings on the deputy marshal. His name was Silas Greer, and he was a land agent from Abilene who had been circling Dusty Creek for the better part of a year, with an interest in acquiring the water rights to the creek that gave the town its name. He was in his mid-30s, well-dressed in the flashy way of city men who came west to make money, and he had spoken to Roy Wilcox twice in the past 6 months about selling the store building, not because he wanted the store, but because the building occupied a lot that abutted the creek's northern bank. Roy had said no both times. Silas Greer kept coming back, which Maggie found considerably more troubling than the water well situation. He came in at 2 o'clock with a smile that was wider than necessary and a suit that was too heavy for the heat, and he leaned on the counter with the practiced ease of a man who believed that ease was persuasive. "Miss Wilcox," he said, "is your father in?" "He is not," she said. "Shame. I had hoped to speak with him about the property situation again." "The property situation," Maggie repeated, "is not a situation. This is our store. It's not for sale." Silas Greer made a sound that was half laugh and half sigh, as if she were being charmingly naive. "Things change, Miss Wilcox. The country's changing fast. The railroad's coming through, and when it does, water rights in this valley are going to be worth 10 times what they are today. Your father would be wise to think about his future." "My father is thinking about it," she said. "And his future, along with the rest of the town's, involves staying right where he is." She looked at him levelly. "Thank you for stopping in, Mr. Greer." He stayed a beat longer than was comfortable, still smiling, and then he straightened from the counter and adjusted his coat. "I'll try again when Roy's available," he said, and walked out. Maggie watched him go with a cold feeling in her chest that was not quite fear but was its neighbor. She was still thinking about it at 6 o'clock when she was locking up the store, and she was thinking about it when she nearly walked into Vernon Barnett on the walkway outside. They both stopped. He caught her by the arm, one hand, steady and brief, and said, "Steady," and then released her immediately. "Sorry," she said, and meant it. "I was thinking." "Hard thoughts?" he asked. She looked up at him. The evening light made everything golden and long, the way evenings in Texas had a habit of doing, as if the land knew it was beautiful and meant to show off. "Do you know a man named Silas Greer?" Something sharpened in his expression. "Land agent out of Abilene." "Why?" "He's been pressing my father to sell this building. He wants the creek water rights." She paused. "He came in again today." Vernon Barnett was quiet for a moment, looking at the street. "He's connected to the Sutters," he said. She stared at him. "What?" "Not directly. But the disruption the Sutters have been causing in this valley, the burned fences, the sick cattle, the bad water, it drives down property values, makes people more likely to sell. A land agent who moves in behind that kind of disruption is either very lucky or very not." He looked at her. "I've been looking into it." Maggie stood on the walkway in the evening heat and felt the shape of something larger than she had seen before settle into place around the town she had grown up in. The Sutters were not just outlaws. They were, in some deliberate way, instruments, being used to clear a path. "That's why they poisoned the well," she said. "Not just to distract people, to make people want to leave." "Yes," he said. She breathed out. That's different from just being dangerous criminals." "It is," he agreed. "It means the man backing them is more important than the brothers themselves." He looked at her steadily. "I'm going to need evidence. The kind that will hold in a federal court." "What kind of evidence are you looking for?" He considered her for a moment. "The kind that shows Greer was paying the Sutters for specific acts, payment records, letters, anything that ties money to action." He paused. "I have someone in Austin working the financial side, but anything local that you or your father might have noticed, payments, transactions that didn't make sense, would help." "My father keeps meticulous records," Maggie said slowly. "He tracks every major transaction in the valley, because the store extends credit to half the ranches around here. If money was moving in unusual ways, he might have noticed something without knowing what it meant." "I'd like to speak with him." "Come to supper," she said, and then immediately wondered if that was the right thing to have said. But it had already left her mouth, and it was the practical, logical thing to offer. Her father would be more forthcoming at the kitchen table than in a formal meeting, and the information might genuinely matter. Vernon Barnett looked at her, and there it was again, that quality of stillness, of full attention. "Thank you," he said. "I'd appreciate that." Supper that evening was roast chicken and cornbread and green beans from the garden, and Roy Wilcox sat across from Vernon Barnett at the kitchen table and talked for an hour and a half with the kind of thorough, organized recollection of a man who had paid careful attention to his world for a long time. Maggie cooked and served and occasionally added something, and she watched her father and the deputy marshal find a rhythm of conversation that looked, she thought, like the beginnings of mutual respect. Roy Wilcox was not easily impressed, but he was fair, and he listened to Vernon Barnett with the quiet attention he gave to things that were worth his consideration. At one point, Roy got up to retrieve a ledger from his study, and they were alone in the kitchen for a moment, Vernon Barnett at the table and Maggie at the dry sink, and the oil lamp making the room warm and close. "Your father is a careful man," Vernon said. "He is," she agreed. "Careful people raised careful children as a rule," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the table, or the middle distance, but the words had a particular quality, as if they were an observation made somewhat against his better judgment. She turned from the dry sink and looked at him. He was sitting with his elbows on the table and his hands loosely folded, and in the lamplight the angular lines of his face were softened by shadow, and he looked, she noticed, almost against her will, tired, in the way a person got tired when they had been carrying a weight for a long time with very little acknowledgement. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. It was a question she had not intended to ask, but the evening felt like it had earned it. He looked up at her. "Fort Worth, then Austin." "My family had a cattle operation east of Fort Worth when I was young." "Had," a pause. "My father died when I was 22. My mother went to live with her sister in San Antonio. My brother runs what's left of the operation." He said it without self-pity, which made it land with more weight. "It wasn't the life for me. I joined the Marshals at 23. She did the arithmetic. He was 28 then, 5 years in the Marshals. She said, 'Do you like it, the work?' He thought about it with the same care he seemed to give everything. 'I like that it matters,' he said. 'I don't always like what it requires.'" Roy came back with the ledger before she could respond, and the conversation returned to Sela's Greer and water rights, and the movement of money in the valley, and Maggie went back to clearing the table, and the moment closed like water over a stone. But she held it. She tucked it somewhere careful, like a letter from a person who might write again. She wrote in her journal that night, "He is 28 and from Fort Worth, and he joined the Marshals because he wanted to do something that mattered. He has been carrying something heavy for a long time. I think he does not tell people this, or not often. I think he told me tonight almost by accident, and I think he knew he was telling me, and he did it anyway." She did not know what to call what she was feeling. She tried several words in her head, and none of them quite fit. She wrote, "I called him arrogant the first day. I called him stubborn the second. I am beginning to think I was wrong about both, or at least that I was only looking at the surface of things." She looked at what she had written for a long time. She did not write the word that was trying to form, because she was not ready for it yet. Friday came in with a hot wind off the plains and a quality of tension in the town that Maggie recognized from the 2 or 3 times in her memory when something significant was about to happen, and everyone could feel it before it did. Vernon Barnett was leaving at noon with Sheriff Poole and the deputy from Laredo, a quiet man named Alejandro Fuentes, who had ridden in Thursday evening and spoken to Vernon for 3 hours at the hotel before going quietly to bed. The plan, as much of it as Vernon had shared with Roy, was to approach the Sutter brothers' camp in the hills south of town and bring them in Jeb and Dale Sutter, and whoever was riding with them, on federal charges that ranged from destruction of property to assault to conspiracy. Maggie knew this. She also knew she had no particular reason to feel anything about it beyond the general hope that her town would be safer by nightfall. She spent the morning behind the counter, serving customers and noting the quiet anxiety in the faces of the people who came in. Mrs. Harlan bought twice as much as she usually bought, which was the habit of a woman who prepared for uncertainty by stocking her pantry. 2 of the ranchers from south of town came in together, speaking in low voices about whether to bring their wives into town for the day. The barber's apprentice, a boy of 16 named Thomas, asked Maggie if she thought there would be shooting. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but Marshal Barnett seems to think it can be managed cleanly." "How does he know?" Thomas asked. "He's done it before," she said, and heard in her own voice something she had not entirely meant to put there. At 11 o'clock she went outside on the pretext of sweeping the walkway, which did not need sweeping. Vernon Barnett was at the livery, saddling the Appaloosa. He moved with the efficient economy of a man who had done this particular thing many times, checking the cinch, adjusting the scabbard, checking the rifle and the sidearm with quick, practiced hands. The deputy from Laredo was doing the same with a rangy bay horse, and Sheriff Poole was already mounted, looking his age and trying not to show it. Maggie stood on the walkway with her broom and told herself she was just getting some air. Vernon looked up as he was checking the cinch and saw her. He said something to the deputy, then walked across the road. He stopped in front of her. The sun was high and the shadows were short, and his eyes were the same dark, steady brown they always were. "I didn't plan to make a production of Leaving," he said. "I didn't plan to watch," she replied. They looked at each other. "Mrs. Harlan's notes," he said. "The timing on the camp, the water analysis. Your father's ledger entries from March showing payments routed through Greer's land office. All of it is in the report I filed last night. If something happens to me today, that report goes to Austin regardless." She understood what he was telling her. He was making sure the work was protected, that the evidence that would hold Silas Greer accountable would survive independent of him. He was telling her, in the way practical people told each other important things, that the job was done regardless of what happened to the man who had done it. "Nothing is going to happen to you," she said. She said it with more certainty than she had the right to, and she saw in the small shift of his expression that it registered. "I meant what I said yesterday," he told her, "about being careful." "I know you did," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "When I get back, if you're willing, I'd like to sit on that back step behind the store and have a cup of coffee and stop thinking about the Sutters for an hour." It was such a plain, honest thing to say. She felt it like a match struck in a dark room. "The coffee will be ready," she said. He nodded once and went back to the Appaloosa, and 3 minutes later he was riding south out of Dusty Creek with Sheriff Poole on his left and Alejandro Fuentes on his right. And Maggie stood on the walkway and watched them go, until the road curved around the livery and took them out of sight. She went back inside and made absolutely no attempt to explain to herself what she was feeling. The hours between noon and 6 on a Friday in June were ordinarily the busiest of the week at the store, with ranchers coming in for the weekend's provisions and farmers settling their accounts, and children spending the coins they had earned on small sweets from the jar by the register. Maggie managed all of it with her usual competence, which cost her more effort than usual because part of her mind was south of town, on a hillside she had never seen, where 3 men were doing something that could go wrong in any number of ways. At 3 o'clock, Clara came in and stood at the counter and said without preamble, "You're worried about him." "I'm worried about Sheriff Poole," Maggie said. "He's 61 and he's been riding desk for the last 3 years, said Clara, "and Deputy Fuentes is practically a stranger." "Also," said Clara, "the Sutters have up to 8 men riding with them." "Maggie," Clara said gently. Maggie stopped. "It's all right," Clara said, "to be worried about a specific person." Maggie looked at her friend, who had the expression of someone trying very hard not to say, "I told you so," about something they had not actually said yet, but had clearly already thought. "He's been in town for 3 days," Maggie said. "I know," Clara said, "and—" Maggie did not answer, which was, of course, an answer. She closed the store at 5:30, which was early, but her father was back by then, and she told him she had a headache and went to the back step and sat down with her hands in her lap, and the evening starting its slow golden burn over the ridge to the west. She heard them at 6:45. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, coming up the south road at a walking pace that said things had been resolved, one way or another. She stood up and went around to the front, and she was not the only one. Half the town seemed to have accumulated on the main road, the way people gathered when something they had been tensely waiting for finally arrived. Sheriff Poole came first, looking tired but intact. Deputy Fuentes came behind him, leading 2 horses whose riders had their hands bound, 2 of the Sutter brothers' men, neither of whom was a Sutter. And then Vernon Barnett on the Appaloosa, riding easy, with Jeb Sutter on a lead rope on his left and Dale Sutter similarly managed on his right. Both brothers were alive, both were subdued. There was a cut on Vernon's left hand, wrapped in a cloth, and a tear in the shoulder of his linen shirt, but he was sitting straight in the saddle and his expression was the same unhurried calm it always was, except that when his eyes found Maggie in the crowd it changed. Very slightly, almost imperceptibly, but she was looking for it and she saw it. The town erupted in the way small towns do when the thing they have been afraid of is removed, people talking all at once, clapping each other on the back, a woman crying quietly near the post office. Sheriff Poole dismounted and shook hands with about 12 people in the first 2 minutes. Alejandro Fuentes dismounted and looked quietly satisfied. Vernon Barnett dismounted, handed the lead ropes to a deputy who materialized from somewhere and walked through the crowd with the focused patience of a man who was being repeatedly congratulated and was receiving it graciously but wanted to be done with it. He made his way to where Maggie was standing at the edge of the crowd. She looked at his hand. "You're hurt." "It's minor," he said. "Let me look at it." He let her look at it. She unwrapped the cloth. Someone had used a handkerchief, torn into strips, competently applied and examined the cut, which was deep enough to need cleaning but not serious. She rewrapped it with the clean cloth she pulled from the pocket she habitually kept supplied for exactly this sort of thing, having grown up next to a livery and a general store in a town that had its share of working injuries. "Thank you," he said. "You said you'd be careful," she said. Her voice came out somewhat unsteady, which she had not entirely planned. "I was careful," he said. "The alternative was considerably worse." She looked up at him, at the cut and the torn shirt and the dark eyes that were looking at her with that quality of complete, unhurried attention that she had been cataloging and carrying and thinking about for 3 days. 3 days. Which was no time at all, and also in the compressed and vivid way of things that matter, a very long time indeed. "The coffee is ready," she said. Something warm and genuine crossed his face, and it was the first time she had seen it entirely unchecked, not the near smile from the first day, not the steady thoughtfulness that was his resting expression, but something genuinely open. "Good," he said. They sat on the back step of the store as the town celebrated behind them, 2 mugs of coffee between them and the evening light slowly softening toward dark. They talked for a long time about the Sutters, about the evidence against Greer, about what would happen next with the legal proceedings, but also about other things, smaller things, the kind of things people talked about when they were becoming acquainted in the real sense of the word. He told her about a river he had camped beside in the hill country the previous autumn, so cold and clear you could count the rocks on the bottom. She told him about the summer when she was 17 that she had tried to teach herself to paint watercolors from a book her mother had owned, and had produced a series of landscapes that her father had diplomatically described as vivid. He laughed at that, a real laugh, not the polite variety, and she felt it like something unlocking in her chest. She told him about her mother, who had died 3 years ago of a fever that came in the fall and went quickly, the way some things did. He listened with the kind of attention that did not rush to fill silence with consolation, just held the weight of it alongside her. He told her about a case 2 years ago that had gone wrong, not in the way that meant someone died, but in the way that meant justice was not served, that a man who had done genuine harm walked away on a legal technicality, and Vernon had had to watch it happen. He said it evenly, but she could hear the particular quiet of a person describing something they had not entirely let go of. "That's why you stay at it," she said, "even when it's hard." "One of the reasons," he said, and looked at her sideways, and the evening was dark enough now that the oil lamp in the kitchen window was throwing its light out onto the step, and she could see his face in that warm yellow glow, and she thought, "There it is. That is the word I have been not writing." The word was perfect. She did not say it, not then. She held it and turned it over and understood that it was not perfect in the naive, uncomplicated way that word was sometimes meant. He was not perfect. He was a man who could be overconfident about his own competence and who moved through unfamiliar places with an authority that not everyone would forgive as readily as she had. He was a man who had learned to keep himself somewhat apart from things, which was a habit of protection that took time to unlearn. He was stubborn in his assessments even when he was willing to update them, and he had a way of making decisions that did not always pause for consultation. But he was perfect in the way that mattered, in the way that meant she could see him, the actual shape of him, and find that what she saw was something she wanted to keep seeing. He was the right particular person at the right particular moment in the right particular way, and that was its own kind of perfection, the honest kind. She was quiet for a moment thinking about this, and then she became aware that he was watching her and that he had been watching her think. "What are you working through?" he asked. "Something that would probably embarrass me to say out loud," she admitted. "You don't seem like a person who embarrasses easily." "I'm not, usually." She looked at him. "But some things are worth being careful with." He looked back at her for a long moment. Outside, the town was quieter now, the celebration winding down as people went inside and the evening settled into itself. Somewhere a dog barked once and then was still. The creek made its low, continuous murmur beyond the back fence. "I'm going to have to go back to Austin," he said. "With the Sutters in custody and the evidence against Greer, I'll need to file in person. It'll take some time to get through the courts." He paused. "But I'll need to come back, to testify. To make sure Greer's case is properly handled. It could be a month, maybe 6 weeks." She was aware of what he was not saying, the way she had learned to be aware of the things he communicated without saying them directly. "6 weeks is not very long," she said carefully. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." The lamp in the kitchen window flickered slightly in a breath of night wind. "I should tell you something," she said. "While I'm being honest with myself anyway." He waited. "I called you arrogant on the first day," she said. "In my head, I watched you ride in and I decided you were arrogant before you'd been in town 5 minutes. I may have given that impression," he said, without any particular self-flagellation about it. "And then the second day I called you stubborn, when you told me you'd handle the watch yourself. Also not entirely unfair," he said. "And today," she said, "today I thought something different about you." She stopped. He was very still, that quality of complete attention focused entirely on her in the lamplight on the back step of her father's store. "What did you think?" he asked. His voice was quiet, and it was not the impersonal quiet of a professional asking a professional question. It was something else entirely. "I thought the word that's embarrassing," she said. A long pause. "Tell me," he said very quietly. She looked at him. She was not a woman who ran from things. She had run her father's store and managed difficult customers and weathered her mother's death and stood her ground against a land agent who had more money than she did and all the weight of civic indifference on his side. She was not afraid of honest things. "Perfect," she said. "I thought perfect, not in the simple way, in the way that means the right particular thing at the right particular time." She looked at her coffee cup. "I'm aware that's quite a lot to put on someone you've known for 3 days." The silence lasted long enough that she began to understand something about him, that he was not silent because he was indifferent but because he was careful with things that mattered to him, and when he spoke next she would know it was not quickly formed. When he spoke, he said, "I heard you the first day, on the walkway. I heard you say something to your friend about me." She went still. "You heard me. I was coming out of the post office. The door was open." He looked at her. "I heard the word arrogant," a pause. "And I thought she's not entirely wrong, and then I thought I would like her to change her mind." Maggie stared at him. He had heard it, on the first day. He had heard her call him arrogant, and instead of being affronted, he had decided to do something about it. "The second day," he continued, "I heard stubborn. I was coming around the corner of the dry goods section when you said it to your friend Clara in the street. I'd just come out of the alley." His mouth curved very slightly. "I thought still not wrong. And I thought she is paying attention." She was somewhere between laughing and something warmer. "You heard all of it," she said. "And you never said anything." "There wasn't much to say," he said, "except to try to be better than what you first saw." She looked at him, this stubborn, competent, careful man who had ridden into her town on a magnificent horse and heard her criticisms and taken them and tried to be better, and she felt the full weight of the word she had thought that morning, the word that was still sitting in her chest like a lamp that had just been lit. "And today," she said, "did you hear today?" "I didn't," he said. "Today was quiet." He held her gaze. "What did you say today?" "I told you," she said. "Perfect." He set his coffee cup down on the step beside him. And then he reached across the small distance between them and took her hand, the way a man did when he was not asking permission, but was also not assuming, when he was offering something that could be accepted or declined. She did not decline. His hand was warm and calloused, and the cut she had rewrapped was on the other one, and she held his hand in the dark of the Texas evening with the creek murmuring beyond the fence and the lamp in the kitchen window and the whole sleeping town around them. "A month," she said. "6 weeks, that's a long time to wait." "I'll write," he said, if you'd want that." "I would want that," she said. He looked at her hand in his, and then at her face, and the expression she saw was the open one, the genuine one, without the professional distance he wore like a second vest. "I'm going to come back," he said, "not just for the testimony." "I know," she said, and she did know. She had known, she thought, since the back step and the coffee had become a thing between them that neither of them had named but both of them had claimed. He left for Austin on Saturday morning, early, with the Sutter brothers in the custody of Sheriff Poole's jail, until the federal transport arrived, and Alejandro Fuentes riding south to coordinate with his office in Laredo. The town turned out to see them off with considerably more warmth than they had shown for the arrival, which was the way of things. People were grateful for results in a way they could not always be for promises. Vernon shook Roy Wilcox's hand on the road outside the store and said something in a low voice that made Roy glance at Maggie with an expression she had not seen from her father in quite some time, a pleased and slightly surprised expression, the expression of a man who had just been told something he had hoped for. Then Vernon turned to Maggie. They were standing in the early morning light with the town around them and a dozen people within earshot, and he said, "I'll write from Austin." "I'll write back," she said. He looked at her for a moment the way he had been looking at her, with the full weight of those dark eyes that did not look away from things. And then he said, quietly enough that it was only for her, "I thought something today, too." She waited. "I thought, she is the most honest person I have met in a long time," he said. "And I intend to come back." She held that like she had held everything he had said carefully, in the good way. "Come back, then," she said. He swung up onto the Appaloosa and looked down at her once, with that small curve at the corner of his mouth that she had catalogued from the very first day and which she now knew was the beginning of a smile he had not quite decided to finish yet. Then he touched his hat brim and rode north, toward Austin, and Maggie stood in the road and watched him go. Roy Wilcox came to stand beside her after a moment. "He asked me," Roy said. She turned to look at her father. "Asked you what?" "If he had my permission to court you properly," Roy said. He had the same pleased, surprised expression. "When he comes back." Maggie looked back at the road where Vernon and his Appaloosa were already small in the distance. "What did you say?" "I said yes," Roy said. "Obviously," she said nothing, but she was smiling. The weeks that followed were full in the way of summer weeks in a working town, the store, the garden, the small daily fabric of Dusty Creek's life. The Sutter case was proceeding in Austin. The federal transport had taken the brothers north. Silas Greer had been confronted by a federal attorney in Abilene with a packet of evidence that included Roy Wilcox's ledger entries, Mrs. Harlan's meticulous notes, and the testimony of the man they had arrested at the well. Greer had not yet been charged, but he had gone conspicuously quiet about the water rights. The first letter came 8 days after Vernon left. It was written in a hand that was precise and slightly angular, exactly as she would have predicted, on federal stationery from the marshal's office in Austin. He wrote about the proceedings, the Sutters formally charged, the case being built against Greer, the meetings with the federal prosecutor. And then at the end, in what she thought was a slightly different register, like a man who had turned to a new page. I think about the back step and the coffee often. I think about the way the creak sounded. I think about a great many things that are not strictly relevant to the Sutter case, but that seemed to occupy a significant portion of my attention anyway. I am not a man who is generally given to this kind of thinking, which perhaps tells you something. Write back if you're willing. She sat at the kitchen table and read it twice, and then wrote back immediately on the good stationery her mother had kept in the parlor desk. She wrote about the store, about Mrs. Harlan, who had sent over a pie in what she called gratitude but was actually, Maggie suspected, matchmaking by proxy. She wrote about the creek, which was running fuller than expected given the dry spell. And then she wrote, with the directness she had always had and which he had said was not the same as sharpness, "You should know that I am not a patient person in the ordinary sense, but I am a person who knows what is worth waiting for. So come back when you can and write until you do, and I'll be here." He wrote back within 5 days. Then she wrote. The letters accumulated through July like the slow building of something architectural, each one adding a piece to the shape of the other person, filling in the spaces that 3 days in a Texas town could not have filled. He told her about his brother Thomas, who was 32 and married with 2 children, and who had made peace with the cattle operation where Vernon never quite had. He told her about the Hill Country River again, in more detail, and she understood that it was a place that mattered to him in the quiet, personal way places did when they had been visited alone. She told him about her watercolors. She had started again, working from the back window, trying to capture the particular quality of evening light on the ridge. She told him about a rancher named Pete Hollies who had come in 2 weeks ago to settle a debt and stayed for an hour talking about his late wife, and how she had sat with him over coffee because that was what was needed. He wrote, "I think you understand something about people that many good people don't. You see what they need before they say it. That is a considerable gift." She held that letter for a long time. 5 weeks and 3 days after he left Dusty Creek, on a Tuesday morning in early August of 1882, Maggie was behind the counter of the general store when she heard hoofbeats on the main road that were distinct, in a way she would not have been able to explain to anyone, from every other set of hoofbeats she heard in a day. She did not go outside immediately. She finished counting the receipts she was working on, because she was not the kind of person who dropped what she was doing simply because her heart had started doing something distracting. She was methodical. She was composed. She closed the receipt ledger and set down the pencil and walked to the front door with deliberate, measured steps. Vernon Barnett was dismounting from the Appaloosa in front of the store. He looked the same dark trousers, same leather vest, same bearing, except that the badge on his chest was different. The federal Deputy Marshal badge had been replaced by something else, and it took her a moment to read it. Special Investigator, Marshal's Service. He saw her in the doorway, and the small curve at the corner of his mouth resolved, for the first time in her memory, into a full, open smile. She came down the 2 steps from the walkway. "You're earlier than 6 weeks," she said. "I finished early," he said. "Greer, charged and in custody. The Sutter case is handed over to the federal prosecutor. My part is done." He paused. "The promotion is effective immediately. I have some latitude about where I'm stationed." Something very large and warm was happening in her chest. "Some latitude," she said. "I spoke with the chief marshal in Austin about the possibility of operating out of a central Texas location," he said. He was looking at her directly, in the way he had always looked at her, with the full weight of his attention. "Dusty Creek is within the relevant territory." She looked at him, at this man she had known for 3 days in June and 5 weeks of letters, and who was standing in front of her store on a Tuesday morning in August with a new badge and a look on his face that she was becoming fluent in reading. "Is that so?" she said. "I spoke with your father as well," he said. "By letter, last week. I asked if he thought you might be amenable to a proper courtship now that I'm back." "He didn't tell me that," she said. though knowing her father she thought he had probably found it quite difficult to keep to himself. "I asked him not to," Vernon said. "I wanted to ask you directly." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking now, Maggie Wilcox. Would you be willing?" She had been willing since the back step and the coffee, since the evening light and his hand over hers, since his voice saying, "I heard you the first day." She had been willing since the letter that said, "I think about the back step and the coffee often," and since every letter after that. "Yes," she said, simply, directly, in the honest way that was hers. The full, open smile came back. It made him look, she thought, considerably younger than the careful professional he usually showed the world, and she was intensely glad to be the person in front of it. "Good," he said. And then, because he was the person he was, and she had learned to love the particular way he said things, "I also brought you something." He reached into the saddlebag and produced, carefully, a small paper-wrapped package. She unwrapped it with the methodical patience she brought to things that mattered. Inside was a set of watercolor paints, a professional set, the kind that came from an art supply house in Austin, 12 colors in a fitted tin case, and a short note in his angular handwriting that said, "For the vivid landscapes." She laughed, and the laugh came from somewhere genuinely delighted, and he looked at her laughing, and the expression on his face was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Come inside," she said. "The coffee is ready." He said, "It always is." He stayed. That was the thing about Vernon Barnett. When he decided something, he decided it fully. He filed the paperwork for the regional assignment and established his office, such as it was, out of a room in the Tanner Hotel that the Marshal's service paid for. He ate supper at the Wilcox house 3 or 4 times a week, and he sat on the back step with Maggie on evenings that were not required anywhere else. And he learned the town, not in the assessing, inventory-taking way of his first day, but in the slow, particular way of a person becoming part of a place. He fixed Mrs. Harlan's fence gate in September, when she mentioned it was sticking, because he had passed it on the way somewhere else and happened to have the tools. He bought a portion of the land east of the creek from a rancher who was retiring and posted it, and no one commented on this, but everyone noticed, because it was the kind of land a man posted when he intended to be somewhere for a long time. He and Roy Wilcox began a habit of chess on Sunday evenings that became, within a month, a highly contested ongoing tournament that Maggie observed with great amusement from behind her watercolors. In October, he brought her a book of landscape paintings by a Hudson River School artist that he had ordered from Austin, because she had mentioned once, in a letter, that she had read about the movement and found it interesting. He set it on the counter during the store's quiet afternoon hour and said, "I thought you might like this." And she looked at the book and then at him and felt, for perhaps the 100th time since his return, the solid, uncomplicated weight of being known by someone. The courtship was, by the standards of the time and the place, properly conducted. He called on her, accompanied her to church, sat beside her at the harvest supper the town held in late October. People began to treat them as a given, which in Dusty Creek meant that Mrs. Harlan no longer sent food over as ostensible gratitude, and instead simply invited them both to Sunday dinner, which was considerably more honest and considerably more comfortable. Clara said, one afternoon in November while helping Maggie arrange a new bolt of fabric in the store, "You look different." "Different how?" Maggie asked. "Happy," Clara said. Specifically, particularly, addressed to a specific person, happy. Maggie smoothed the fabric. "Is that different from regular happy?" "Completely different," Clara said. "Regular happy is general. This kind has a name." Maggie said nothing, but she was smiling at the fabric, which she suspected said everything anyway. In November, Silas Greer was formally convicted in federal court of conspiracy to commit property fraud and accessory to multiple counts of criminal mischief and assault. The conviction was reported in the Austin papers and the Regional Gazette, and when the Gazette arrived in Dusty Creek with the report, Roy Wilcox read it at the breakfast table and set it down and said, quietly, "Good." Maggie thought about all the ranchers who had watched their cattle run off and their fences burned, about Emmett McGrath's broken arm, about the bad water that had made horses skittish and children ill, about the slow, deliberate campaign to make a town surrender itself to a man with a ledger and a city suit. And she thought, good, good and done, and let it be done. That evening she told Vernon about it on the back step, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, Mrs. Harlan's notes were a significant part of the case. The prosecutor said so in his close. I'll tell her, Maggie said. She'll be insufferably pleased. She's earned it, he said. She has, Maggie agreed. They sat with their coffee in the November air, which was cool enough now to warrant coats, and the creek murmured its lower, colder sound, and the lamp in the kitchen window made its warm square of light on the dark. I'm going to ask you something, Vernon said. She looked at him. I've been working up to it for several weeks, he said, with the sort of candor that was one of the things she had come to count on absolutely. I had a speech prepared and I've discarded it twice because it sounded like something I'd put in an official report. She felt the smile starting at the corner of her mouth. Just say it plain. I love you, he said. That's the first part. I wanted to say that first, before the question, so you knew the question was coming from that and not from anything else. She was very still, in the way of someone receiving something they had been expecting and still finding it more than they were prepared for. I love you, he continued, in the way where I have tried to be the right version of myself in front of you since the first day, which was partly because I heard what you said about arrogance and partly because you are the most honestly perceptive person I have known and I did not want to be less than what you deserve to see. He looked at her. And I want to ask you to marry me, if you'll have me. The night was quiet and the creek was quiet and the lamp was steady in the window, and Maggie Wilcox looked at Vernon Barnett and thought, I called him arrogant the first day and I was wrong about the depth of it. I called him stubborn the second day and I was not wrong, but I was only seeing part of what that stubbornness was, that it was the stubbornness of a man who kept trying to be what he believed in regardless of difficulty, and that was not a fault at all. And on the third day I thought perfect, and I had never used that word about a person before and I have never regretted using it since. And he heard all of it. He heard the arrogance and the stubborn, and instead of being affronted or walking away, he had taken what was true in it and tried to be better. Yes, she said. Vernon, yes. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small, clear stone, the kind of ring that was honest and lasting and not trying to be more than it was, and he took her hand, the same way he had that first evening, with the same quality of offering rather than assuming. And he put it on her finger and held her hand in both of his. I've been carrying that since October, he said. October, she repeated. I ordered it from the jeweler in San Antonio in September, he said. I kept losing my nerve. She looked at him, this man who rode into towns with the authority of a federal badge and never lost his nerve about anything professional, who had been carrying a ring in his coat pocket for 6 weeks because he was afraid she might say no. She found it extraordinarily dear. You should have known, she said. I know now, he said. That's sufficient. She laughed and he smiled and the lamp burned steadily in the kitchen window, and somewhere out beyond the fence the creek ran cold and dark and permanent, and Dusty Creek slept around them, and everything was settled. They married in the spring, on a Saturday in April of 1883, in the church on 2nd Street, where Maggie had sat every Sunday since she could remember. It was a ceremony of the kind she had always privately imagined, not large or elaborate, but attended by every person in the town who mattered, which was most of them. Clara stood beside her as her witness. Alejandro Fuentes, who had come up from Laredo for the occasion, stood beside Vernon. Roy Wilcox walked his daughter to the front of the church with the expression of a man who had been blessed twice in his life, once when his wife was alive, and once in the continuity of what she had helped build, and he did not cry until he sat down, and then he did not stop for some time. Mrs. Harlan brought 3 pies to the reception and sat in the corner accepting congratulations as if she had arranged it all herself, which, Maggie reflected, was not entirely untrue. The service was simple. Vernon said his vows in the same low, steady voice he used for everything that mattered, and he looked at her the whole time, which she knew was because he was a man who meant things fully and looked at them when he meant them. She said hers with the directness she had always had, and when she got to the part about love and keeping, she felt the word perfect form in her mind again, and she thought, yes, still that. After the ceremony, standing in the cool spring sunshine outside the church, Clara took her arm and leaned close and said very quietly, "I told you, give him a chance." "You were right," Maggie said. "I know," said Clara, beaming. "I intend to mention it occasionally for the rest of your natural life." "I know," said Maggie. "I consider it a reasonable price." They settled on the land Vernon had posted east of the creek. He had bought it outright during the winter, and through the spring and summer of their first year together, they worked it with the help of 2 men from town, adding to the small frame house that had been on the property, building a proper barn, planting a kitchen garden that Maggie managed with the same organized attention she gave everything she touched. It was different from the store, which she still helped her father with 3 mornings a week. It was quieter, more physical, more seasonal. She found that she loved the way working land was honest. It required exactly what it required and gave back exactly what you put in, no more and no less, and it did not have moods or pretensions. She painted it on Sunday afternoons, the ridge to the west and the creek and the long, flat golden reach of the range, and she got better at it, and the tin of paints Vernon had brought her in August became irreplaceable. Vernon continued his work for the Marshal's service out of the regional office, which meant he was away sometimes, a week here, 2 weeks there, and she was honest about the fact that she disliked it, and he was honest about the fact that he would not stop, and they had come to an understanding about it that was workable and real, that she would tell him when the absence was hard and he would tell her when the work was hard, and they would not pretend that either thing was simple. It was, she thought, the most functional arrangement she had ever observed between 2 people, and it was theirs. Their son, James Roy Barnett, was born in February of 1884. He came into the world with considerable determination and dark eyes that were unmistakably his father's and a vocal quality that suggested he had opinions, and intended to share them, which Maggie thought was fitting. Vernon was home for the birth, which had been the subject of some careful logistical arrangement on his part, and he sat beside the bed afterward with his son in his arms and looked at him with an expression that was entirely new on his face, something Maggie had no catalog entry for, something purely unguarded and enormous. He looked up at her after a moment and said, "I don't have a prepared speech for this either." "You don't need one," she said. He looked back at his son. "Him's Roy," he said, testing the name. "After my father and yours," she said. They had agreed on it weeks ago. Roy Wilcox, who had come over from the store the moment he heard and had been pacing the parlor for 3 hours, was currently sitting in the kitchen with his 3rd cup of coffee, waiting with barely contained emotion for permission to come in and meet his grandson. "He has your forehead," Vernon said. "He has your stubbornness, I suspect," she said. "We'll see." Vernon smiled. The full, open one. "He'll be all right then. Better than all right," she said. Roy Wilcox came in shortly after, moving with the careful reverence of a man entering something sacred, and he held his grandson for a long time without saying anything useful, and Maggie watched her father and her husband and her new son in the February light and thought about the word perfect again, and found it was still accurate. James was a healthy, interested child who approached the world with a combination of his father's focused intensity and his mother's practical directness that made him a handful in the specific and charming way of children who are entirely themselves from the beginning. He learned to walk by holding onto the legs of the store counter, since Maggie still went in mornings, and he learned his first words in approximately the order of any child of a general store: Mama, Papa, Coffee, No, and the name of their dog, a brown hound named Barley who had appeared at the back step one morning in the summer of their first year and declined to leave. In the spring of 1886, their daughter, Frances Elaine Barnett, arrived with considerably less drama than her brother, but made her presence known within the first week through a quality of focused attention that made Maggie laugh when she recognized it. Frances watched everything from the very beginning: the lamp, the window, the dog, and most particularly her father, who was, in Frances's clearly decided opinion from approximately the age of 6 weeks, the most interesting thing in any room. Vernon, for his part, was entirely undone by his daughter in a way that Maggie had predicted, and which she documented in her journal with considerable affection. A man who had ridden into burning situations in the service of federal law for 6 years was apparently susceptible to being looked at with absolute trust by a small person who found him wonderful, and Maggie thought this was entirely right and proper. Roy Wilcox was by then what could honestly be described as thriving in his grandfather role, which involved being at the farm 2 evenings a week and bringing sweets from the store jar and teaching James, at age 3 and then 4, the particular chess moves he used against Vernon on Sundays. Vernon claimed no knowledge of this. Maggie was quite sure he was aware of it and found it deeply satisfying. Clara Mills, who had married a carpenter named David Hensley in the summer of 1883 and now had a son of her own, remained Maggie's closest friend, and the two families had Sunday dinners together approximately twice a month through the years that followed, dinners that involved a great deal of noise and coffee and conversation and occasional chess, and which were the kind of regular gathering that built into the architecture of a life, the same way good wood built into a house. Mrs. Harlan turned 73 in the fall of 1886 and sent over a piece of her birthday cake with a note that said, with characteristic Harlan precision, "I understand I played some part in the proceedings of 4 years past. I consider this an acceptable legacy. The cake is maple walnut." Vernon read the note and set it down and said, "I should have given her a formal commendation." "She would have framed it," Maggie said. "Obviously," he said. On the evening of their 4th wedding anniversary, in April of 1887, Vernon and Maggie sat on the back step of the farmhouse. The back step that had replaced, in their domestic geography, the back step of the store, though the creek was the same creek and the evening light was the same evening light, and drank coffee from the same battered tin mugs they had used since the beginning, because there were objects that became themselves in the context of things that mattered and could not be replaced without loss. James was asleep inside. Frances was asleep. Barley the dog was asleep with his head on Vernon's boot. The ridge to the west was dark against a sky that still held the last of the sunset in a long, slow fade. "I want to tell you something," Maggie said. He looked at her in the way he had always looked at her. "I've been thinking about something you said once," she said, "about why you stayed at the work, that you liked that it mattered." She looked at her coffee cup. "I think that's the thing about you that I knew first, even when I was calling you arrogant and stubborn. That you were doing something because it mattered, not because it was easy or profitable or because anyone was watching. And I think that's what I recognized, before I had words for it." He was quiet for a moment in the way she had learned to read as thinking rather than absence. "You recognized it because it's the same thing in you," he said finally. "The store, your father's customers, Pete Holly's and his late wife, Mrs. Harlan's gate. You do what needs to be done because it matters, not because it's noted." He looked at her directly in the lamplight with the full and unhurried attention he had given her since the first week. "I recognized it too, very early." She leaned against him, which was something she had the right to do now and which she exercised without ceremony, because it was ordinary and real, and she preferred ordinary real things to extraordinary performances. His arm came around her, which was the same natural, settled, the habit of a person who had learned where home was and gone there willingly. "4 years," she said. "4 years," he agreed. "James is going to beat your father in chess within 3 years," she said. "Roy has been teaching him your specific openings." She felt, rather than saw, the smile. "I've been watching," he said. "I've been using different openings for 2 months." You're preparing to be outsmarted by a 4-year-old. A 4-year-old who is half you, he said. I'd be a fool not to. She laughed, and the laugh went out into the cool April evening, and the creek ran below the fence, and the lamp burned in the kitchen window, and the children slept inside, and the dog slept on Vernon's boot, and the ridge to the west kept its dark and permanent shape against the last of the light. This was Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1887, which was 11 years before the century would turn, and 37 years after the state had come into its own, when the wild country was still wild enough to require the kind of men who wore federal badges and rode Appaloosa horses into suffering towns, and heard what people said about them and tried to be better. This was what had grown from 3 days in June of 1882, and a word called arrogant, and a word called stubborn, and a word called perfect, and from a man who heard all 3 of them and did not look away. Maggie thought about writing it down that night when the children were still sleeping, and the house was quiet, and Vernon was at the kitchen table with the lamp and a letter from the Austin office that would require a response. She got out the journal, which was its 3rd volume now, and turned to a new page. She wrote, "This is what 4 years looks like. It looks like James's dark eyes and Francis's quiet attention and Barley on the back step, and Roy Wilcox winning at chess and Clara's Sunday dinners, and a tin of watercolor paints that have been used down to the last 1/4 inch. It looks like letters and back steps and coffee that is always ready, and a man who heard arrogant and heard stubborn and heard perfect and chose to keep coming back through all 3. She paused and looked at the lamp, and then at Vernon's back at the kitchen table, the familiar shape of him in the familiar light. She wrote, "I would call him arrogant today too if pressed, because he is, but I know now what the arrogance costs him, that it is not complacency but the weight of believing things should be better than they are, and pushing toward that regardless. And I would call him stubborn because he is that too, but his stubbornness is the kind that stays when staying is required, that holds the line when the line is real, that comes home when home is what matters." She thought for a moment. "And I would still call him perfect," she wrote. "I would still mean it exactly the way I meant it the first time. Not simple, not uncomplicated, not without fault or stubbornness or the particular quality of a man who has learned to carry things alone for too long and is only slowly learning to set things down. Perfect in the honest sense. The right particular person at the right particular time in the right particular way. Mine." She closed the journal. At the kitchen table, Vernon finished his letter, folded it, and set it aside, and then turned and looked at her across the room. "You're writing," he said. "I was," she said. "Something good, something true," she said, "which is the same thing mostly." He rose from the table and came to where she was sitting and held out his hand the same way he always had, offering rather than assuming, which had not changed in 4 years and which she knew would not change in 40 more. She took it. "Come to bed," he said. "You can write the rest tomorrow." "There isn't a rest," she said. "It was complete." He looked at her, and the open smile was there, the one that had been there from the moment she came down those 2 steps in August and found him on the road with a new badge and watercolor paints in his saddlebag. "Good," he said. She stood up and put out the lamp and let him lead her through the quiet house where their children slept and their dog snored by the back door and the creek ran beyond the fence in the dark, and she thought, yes, good, complete, everything accounted for, everything resolved. Everything as it should be, in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1887, where a woman named Maggie Wilcox had once stood on a walkway and watched a man ride in on an Appaloosa and made up her mind about him before she knew a single true thing about him, and had the rare and specific good fortune of being wrong.